Welcome back to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going through the rest of our character archive, talking about the other different characters, talking about a build guide as well as a tips guide on how you want to build them, how you want to play them, and everything going on with different characters. And we've gone all the way through our other characters and had to back up actually last time for Emily, but now we're making our way over to NILOU. So going ahead and checking out NILOU, first and foremost, looking at talent leveling priority. Now, the quote-unquote leveling priority here is technically actually you don't have to level into anything at all. As we're going to get into the first and second passive talents already, you're going to find out that you actually don't need to level into any of these first three skills at all technically when you're actually building your NILOU because of the bloom that she's doing. And so actually technically you can just stay at triple one. Now for other people who want to play, NILOU differently and, add maybe a little bit more personal damage of extra hydro hits here and there, you can level into the skill and the burst. I would probably stay on these two specifically, especially the burst is going to be nice to level into, but technically you don't have to level into any of these at all. But keep in mind also, even with some of the skill stuff, which we'll go in through in a second, is based still on skill damage. So no matter what, still the leveling of the normal attacks is basically kind of useless. But let's go ahead and talk about her skill. She's going to enter into the pirouette state when using her skill and deals hydro damage to nearby opponents based on NILOU's max HP. When she's in the pirouette state, or as soon as you've pressed the skill once, you can either do 2 normal attacks or do 2 skill usages, which will cause her to enter into the sword dance for the normal attacks and whirling steps for the actual elemental skill usages. Both of these instances, either way, basically either route you go, will cause damage to deal based on her hydro damage that's converted for specifically her normal attacks. And then also that hydro damage cannot be overridden as it is an infusion, and that damage is based and considered as elemental skill damage, which is why you don't have to level into her normal attack. In these stances, NILOU's third dance step will end the pirouette state, which is why you basically have, once again, those next few steps is then when you're ending the pirouette state. And at this point in time, the following effects, based on the type of said dance step that you go through, will happen. The sword dances, or doing more normal attacks after the initial skill use, will unleash a luminous illusion that deals hydro damage to opponents it touches and grants NILOU the Lunar Prayer effect. This effect converts NILOU's normal attacks into sword dance techniques, which by the way, remember, are infused with hydro, and her final hit will unleash a luminous illusion. Next is the whirling steps, and NILOU unleashes a whirling water wheel that deals AoE hydro damage, so after multiple uses of the skill back to back to back, then it will create a tranquility aura around it that will follow your active character and apply the wet status to opponents within its AoE that it hits. This is going to be very good for constant application for the enemies if you're constantly trying to create the bloom effect, which you're most likely going to try to do for the future when we actually talk about these passive talents. NILOU is also unable to perform charge attacks while she's under the effect of pirouette or the lunar prayer effect, and these effects will be removed once she leaves the field. Next, we're going to be talking about her burst. Basically, she's going to cause a huge AoE hydro damage hit that is based on NILOU's max HP, and she will also apply the lingering Eon effect to all the opponents that she hits. After a certain interval, opponents affected by the lingering Eon effect will then take hydro damage. So the initial hit is going to be this amount at level 1, about 18% of her max HP, and you're getting a pretty nice buff of actually the lingering Eon effect damage that's happening afterwards. They're actually going to take more damage than the initial hit of when she actually does her burst. Which is why if you're trying to go for more personal damage as well on top of the blooms, and you're leveling into your talents a little bit on NILOU, I would mainly focus on going for the burst and the skill, obviously, because these extra sword dance and whirling step hits are going to be nice, and obviously the luminous illusion initial hit as well as the water wheel that's going to be happening is also going to do some extra damage for you, and that'll be actually pretty helpful if you want to level into these a little bit more. But now really the bread and butter of NILOU's kit are her 2 passive talents, and they kind of have 2 different reasons. The first passive talent is mainly for basically creating what we're going to call later bountiful cores, and the second passive talent is actually giving a huge damage buff to those bountiful cores. So the first passive talent states that when all characters in the party are all Hydro and Dendro characters, kind of like how Chevrus is basically giving in a passive talent she has. They all have to be Pyro and Electro characters, with one being at least Dendro and at least one Hydro. The completion of the third dance step from her skill will grant all nearby characters the Golden Chalice's bounty for 30 seconds. While characters are under the effect of Golden Chalice's bounty, this will increase the elemental mastery of all nearby characters by 100 for 10 seconds whenever they are hit by Dendro attacks. Now, the biggest thing you want to know here is that by doing so, with NILOU, once again you're trying to create bloom reactions, and as you know, when a bloom explodes, your character can actually get hit by it, which means a bloom number is a Dendro hit, which means technically your character is going to be getting hit by the Dendro attacks consistently, giving also, when this happens, more elemental mastery. So actually getting hit by a bunch of bloom cores that you've created is actually a good thing. Also, triggering the bloom reaction will create bountiful cores instead of Dendro cores. So now once again we have this idea of, instead of creating the regular bloom cores, we now have bountiful cores. Such cores will burst very quickly after being created, compared to the normal Dendro bloom cores that take a little while to explode, and they will have larger AoEs, which means more possible damage amongst more enemies if there's multiple waves of them. Bountiful cores cannot trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon, and they share an upper numerical limit with Dendro cores. Bountiful core damage is considered damage dealt by Dendro cores produced by the bloom, which means at this point that you need to keep in mind anything that's based off of a Dendro core, its type of damage, how it works, everything is going to be mirrored with the Bountiful core. The only difference between the Bountiful core is what we can get in the second passive talent later, as well as it's already been stated before. The only difference between them is that these Bountiful cores right now are going to be bursting a lot more quickly, or basically exploding quicker, and then also they'll have larger AoEs. That is the only difference. Everything else is the exact same, and any other types of buffs or whatnot created by Bloom or buffing Bloom will buff these specific hits as well. Should the party not meet the conditions for this passive talent, any existing Golden Chalice's bounty effects will be cancelled, basically meaning as soon as you don't get, or you take out a Hydro or Dendro character in here and you put another Pyro character or any element that's not Dendro or Hydro, then the Golden Chalice's effect will then be remissed and will go away. Now, looking at the second passive talent, this is where, once again, that first passive talent is helping you create the bountiful cores, which are going to be exploding quicker and have a larger AoE, possibly giving some extra elemental mastery as well. So that's it's basically setting up the mechanic for NILOU to work. Now her second passive talent is where the damage starts to come in. Every 1,000 points of NILOU's max HP above 30,000, so if you're at 35,000, it won't be 35 instances of this, it'll only be 5. This will cause the damage dealt by bountiful cores created by the characters affected by Golden Chalice's bounty to increase by 9%. The maximum increase in bountiful core damage that can be achieved this way is 400%. Now, the idea basically here that you want to keep in mind is that the maximum amount of HP that you can get from this passive is, I believe, like 74 or just almost 75,000 HP. Now with NILOU, even going for max HP and all these other things, it can be pretty difficult to crack 70,000 HP, and usually people get to around, if they can, about 72,000 HP. And that is an amazing feat in and of itself, meaning you're almost getting this 4 times damage buff on your bountiful core damage. And this is why HP is so necessary on NILOU, and why so many people go for only HP and don't go for crit, because bountiful cores, they are just like bloom cores, cannot crit, which means that NILOU, all she needs to do, don't go into attack, because once again, these bloom cores are based off of HP, this damage bonus is based off HP. But the bloom core or bountiful core itself initially is based off of a bloom core, which means the only thing that's going to buff a bloom core for stat wise is just level of the character, so get your NILOU to level 90, and also the elemental mastery of said character, which means other characters increasing her elemental mastery is going to be good as well. Stuff like this is going to be extremely good though, because now NILOU is just like the other bloom characters. But the thing that makes her even better is that she can now put a personal damage bonus with more HP on top of these bountiful cores to actually make them worthwhile. So never mind are they exploding quicker, which means consistent and faster DPS, but also the higher amount of damage bonus that you can get and the wide AoE with it. This is the reason why I think that NILOU is going to be such a great character from now, obviously, and from the past, even into a very long time in the future. And it's going to be very hard to kind of go past her and make something better, just because of how well she's been built and the amount of characters that are coming out, and in the future probably as well, that can make her just better and better. Looking beyond passives though, let's go ahead and look at a sword user that I have so we can actually see it, because I do not have NILOU. So let's go ahead and look at a sword user and look at some different weapons that you're going to want to use. Now, the first weapon that you're going to look for, obviously, is the Key of Kajnisu. Now, the Key of Kajni suit is going to be good, obviously. Like normal, we don't really talk about the actual weapons that are personalized for the 5-star characters because obviously that's going to be their best weapon. But the Key of Kajni suit has an HP percent main stat, which we've talked about is the reason why NILOU is so good. So obviously, this is going to be her best weapon. So that is really kind of the only way I really want to go about this, because obviously the ability on the weapon is going to be perfectly tailored to her, increasing HP, elemental skill, more damage, more elemental mastery, which means more damage, all these other things. It's a great weapon. If you have it, it should be on your NILOU if you have her. Now, another weapon I do want to talk about, which is a very good weapon, is going to be the Dockhand's Assistant. This main stat is also HP percent, and honestly, I have this at level 80, but at level 90, it gives you 41% HP. Now that's very good for a 4-star, considering the 5-star gives like 66%. So it's about 20% HP off, and that is based off of basically this extra HP is based off of NILOU's like base HP. So adding that on top of what you can get is going to be very, very good. But I really do like this weapon as well. It can give some extra elemental mastery, and it's going to be very easy to proc this extra thing in the middle here, because you're probably going to be healing and using like consistent healers. Characters like Baiju, as well as Yao Yao and Barbara, some characters that are going to be pretty consistent maybe with their heals and pretty quick with it, meaning that you can get these stacks of these symbols pretty quickly, which then means that you can get an extra elemental mastery buff and some extra energy, which once again is more just personal damage from NILOU herself. So I do really like the Dockhand's Assistant, and I honestly think it's better than even some of the other 5-star options besides her personal weapon. Speaking about other 5-star weapons that are going to be extremely good for her, another weapon like Freedom Sworn is way up there. Now, also, never mind just the main stat of almost 200 elemental mastery given to the character, because like I said before, Bountiful Core's initial damage is going to be a combination of elemental mastery and character level, like normal Bloom Cores, with the addition of extra HP because of NILOU's passive talent. But still, elemental mastery is a big part of making that damage skyrocket. So having a lot of elemental mastery, even on the weapon, could and still can be a very good option to go for, and usually is for most people if they don't have her weapon or Dockhands. The ability on the weapon isn't too crazy, because the second part of it just kind of increases normal and charge attack and plunging attack damage, and it also increases attack, which NILOU's not really using most of those, because even her normal attacks in her pirouette state that you can do are considered elemental skill damage, so it doesn't really help out, which is why you don't level into her normal attack, even if you are going to level into her talents. But the beginning of this weapon still, and the ability for the refinement stat does give you like a 10% at R1 increased damage ability, which does count for any type of damage you do for the character. So there is something that you can use in the ability, but it's not really necessary, and the real main reason you're getting it is really because of the high amount of EM that you can get from the main stat. Going behind that weapon, I would use something like Zyphos' Moonlight and even something like Iron Sting. I personally like Iron Sting a little bit more, just because Iron Sting helps with more damage and can get more damage stacks on it. They have the same amount of elemental mastery. The only reason that people might want to use instead of Iron Sting here, a lot of people use for other characters Zyphos' Moonlight, because Zyphos' Moonlight can give more energy recharge. The personal thing about being with the whole energy recharge thing is that with energy recharge on NILOU, you don't really need it. It's nice to have the burst. It's kind of like Hazo or another character like Wanderer, who kind of don't really need their burst, and if it comes up, it's nice to use and you can use it. It's just extra bits of damage, but it's not necessary to their kit. And so it's the same thing here. The extra energy recharge isn't really necessary, and since they both give the same amount of elemental mastery, I think Iron Sting does it better, because dealing elemental damage will increase all damage by a certain percentage, and it has 2 stacks as well, and that can occur once every 1 second. And you're going to be pretty easy to consistently, give these stacks up, because once again, those Bloom Bountiful Cores that NILOU creates are going to be happening very quickly and going to be exploding very quickly. Also, if you really want to, you can even use a weapon like Tokubo Shigure, who also has an extra damage buff on this as well. Same amount of elemental mastery from the other weapons. And yeah, I mean, honestly, these are some of your best weapons. If you're looking in terms of 4 stars, the best one's going to be Dockhand's Assistant, and the backups are going to be something like Iron Sting, Tokubo Shigure, and the other weapon, Zyphos' Moonlight. You can use some other ones, I guess, that could kind of be elsewhere, things like Favonius Sword if you really want energy, or I guess anything else that would kind of be helpful for it, like if you have Festering Desire, just for more skill damage. But once again, you're not really looking for skill damage. You're trying to go full blown into either elemental mastery or HP to make sure that her bloom cores or those bountiful cores are going to be doing the most damage possible, because that's the major way that she's going to be helping out the team to do a lot of damage. Now I want to jump over and look at artifacts. In terms of artifacts, NILOU is kind of almost weird in a sense. And the reason I say that is because most people actually don't use her personal set when looking at NILOU. So let's go ahead and talk about her personal set, which is the 4-piece of Flower of Paradise Lost. The reason why a lot of people don't do this is because they really just usually go for a 2-piece of HP percent and another 2-piece HP percent from like Tenacity or something like that. So usually you'll see a combination of Tenacity and Vorakash's Glow for the extra HP, which is then helping obviously that passive talent to then basically get as close as possible to that max ceiling of like 74,500 HP. And it's really just stacking that. So if you have, in my personal opinion, if you don't have her weapon and you have like, let's say an EM weapon, then going for a 2-piece HP is actually worth it. But if you have her weapon, or for instance, even if you're using Dockhand's Assistant that is already HP percent, I would actually go for the Flower of Paradise Lost 4-piece set, because you're already getting some extra elemental mastery from the 2-piece, which 80 is still very good to get. And also the 4-piece is very good. The equipping characters Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon reaction damage are increased by 40%. Now, once again, keep in mind that the passive talent stated that anything that has to do with Bloom is still going to help her personal, beyond the Dendro cores, it is also the same as her Bountiful cores, because they are the same. So anything that's increasing Bloom damage is increasing the Bountiful core damage that she has. That is an extra increase of 40%. Additionally, after the equipping character triggers Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Burgeon, which they probably will be again, NILOU in this instance, they will gain another 25% bonus to the effect mentioned prior. Now that's not another 25% on top of 40 being 65%, it means 40 plus 10 is now 50%. On top of that, each stack of this lasts 10 seconds and you can get 4 stacks at the same time, which also means that since these are triggered separately and can happen once per second, and considering once again going over the constant blooms and the constant amount of blowing up that's happening with these bountiful cores because they're blowing up quicker, you can get these stacks very quickly, as well as these stacks can basically always stay on the uptime. And so if there's 4 stacks of 10% on top of 40, that's an 80% bloom damage buff. You're almost practically doubling the amount of damage that you're seeing from your bloom cores or from these bountiful cores. Never mind, once again, the extra HP that you can get it. And even if you're someone who uses NILOU off field, the character who equips this can still trigger its effects when not on the field. So even if you're using the Tranquility Aura, where you use the skill multiple times to create that wheel around you, you can still actually technically create this and still get the buffs for this pretty consistently as well. So once again, keep in mind, if I would say if you have an HP percent weapon and you are going for full-blown HP a lot in already her kit, and you already have like 65 to 70,000 HP, honestly, I would just stick with going right into the 4-piece of Flower of Paradise Lost. Now, once again, you can go ahead and test this and, kind of work around it. A lot of people should have already some 2 pieces of the Tenacity set already. So if you want to, you can definitely go ahead and do that. But also, if you are running an EM, already weapon, then going for more HP to try to make up for the loss of HP in your, weapon, it could make sense in going for 2-piece HP, 2-piece HP with it. Now I'll go ahead and looking at the main stats as well. In my personal opinion, once again, if you already have an HP percent weapon, you can go for triple HP to just still go all the way across HP and just try to get the maximum amount of HP. Let the kind of substats that you're looking for in EM and flat HP kind of just take up the HP that you're, or the EM that you're already getting. And since once again, if you already have an HP weapon, I already told you, you should be running a 4-piece of Flower of Paradise Lost, giving you 80 elemental mastery, plus other characters can give you elemental mastery, and the double dendro, so the elemental resonance that you're getting from that is increasing it even more. You could possibly get up to almost 200 EM just by using these sets, never mind substats that you're getting from these different things, meaning you could easily have around 300 to 400 EM just by still even going for a full-blown HP on your main stats, as well as the weapon going for HP as well. So that's very easy to do, but if you're like, well, I don't have a lot of EM in my, substats or whatever, then you can go for an EM Sans, especially if you have it on set for, the 4-piece flower. Let's say you have, just something on set and it's going to work very well. Going for an HP 50%, sands or goblet or whatever, because HP and EM are still very easy to go across all three of the different things up the top, your sands, your goblet, and your circlet, then it's going to be very easy in the future to just be able to get them consistently. So once again, go for that if you can. If it's on set, it's fine if you can get EM as well, but I would just, once again, try to get as much HP as you can while still trying to make sure that with your team comp and everything, you're making sure that you can still get a good amount of EM with it as well. Diving back over into NILOU once again though, looking at the actual constellations that she has. Let's go ahead and look at the constellations. The first constellation states that the skill will be enhanced as follows. The luminous illusion damage that she has will be increased by 65%, and the tranquility aura's duration is extended by 6 seconds. So if you actually have the C1, in my personal opinion, this is when a lot of people probably at C0 probably aren't going to be really leveling their skill and their burst, and that's usually fine. Like honestly, you don't have to. It's an extra bits of damage, but if you want to focus on other characters and kind of get to NILOU kind of built pretty quickly, then you can go ahead and just kind of keep those talents unleveled. But as soon as you get to C1, in my personal opinion, I think that's where you can actually, it kind of makes sense to actually level into the skill. Because of this damage buff you can get here from the first constellation, leveling into your skill actually then does make sense if you want to do that, because once again, you're just making more out of the personal damage that she can get. Looking at the C2, it states that after characters affected by the Golden Chalice's bounty deal hydro damage to an opponent, that opponent's resistance will then be decreased for hydro resistance by 35% for 10 seconds, which once again, if you have the C1, you've already probably most likely started to level into your skill and your burst, which means now the skill and burst hydro hits are now doing more damage because the hydro resistance is now decreased, never mind the buff that you can get from your skill for the luminous illusion steps as well, helping more damage for personal damage for the hydro hits that you get from NILOU. Also, after a triggered bloom reaction deals damage to opponents, their dendro resistance will be decreased by 35% for 10 seconds. And you're thinking, well, this is NILOU. Why would I want this two-piece? This, this second constellation. This is kind of just helping, like the second half of this is just kind of helping like other dendro characters. Once again, keep in mind, blooms and even her actual bloom cores that she makes specifically, those bountiful cores, are actually dendro hits, which means the bloom reaction that she's creating, which is still a part of what she's actually doing, even if it's a bountiful core, it's still a bloom reaction. When that deals damage to an opponent, the dendro resistance of that opponent is decreased, which means the next 10 seconds, the next multiple instances of her, bountiful cores exploding are going to be doing way more damage because of this dendro resistance decrease on those enemies. Now, the C3 increases the level of the burst by 3, and the C5 increases the level of the skill by 3. The C4 states that after the third dance step of her skill's pirouette hits an opponent, NILOU will gain 15 elemental energy, and the damage from her burst will be increased by 50% for 8 seconds. The more and more that you get constellations through NILOU, the more and more it makes sense for you to actually level into her skill and her burst. The first two constellations really only help out the skill of kind of actually in the first constellation only really helps out the skill. Once you get into the C2, then you can honestly, because it's just helping hydro damage in general, the burst starts to make sense to level into as well. And especially with the C4 increasing 50% more damage that you get. So 1.5 times damage, let's say you're hitting a 50k, now you're going to be hitting 75ks on that actual burst hit. Also, keep in mind that this is a 50% damage hit for the entire burst, which means, if you remember from her burst, she's doing 2 hits. So actually, this is 1.5 times damage, and the second hit of Lingering Eon is also 1.5 times damage, because this is helping the entirety of the burst. Also, now looking at the C6, for every 1000 points of max HP, NILOU's crit rate and crit damage will increase by 0.6% crit rate and 1.2% crit damage, respectively. And the maximum increase you can get in crit rate and crit damage based off the HP is 30% and 60%. Now, doing the math there, basically the maximum you can get is 50,000 HP from the C6, and once again, you'll probably have even more than that when you're kind of going for the passive talent, once again, because the max here is like almost 75,000 HP. So even still with this constellation, the reason why I think this is helping more is maybe to make a more personal NILOU, and especially if you have a C6 already character here by looking at specifically her, you might already have as well a C2 Nahida, and basically that means that blooms, hyper blooms, and burgeons are going to be able to crit, So that's helping already as well. Most likely you're pairing these two characters together. So helping her crit personally is probably helping more or less the entire damage, because the other constellations aren't helping really any more bloom necessarily besides the C2. It's actually, even with the C2, still helping the personal damage from NILOU. So more and more you start to see more damage buffs for the personal skill and burst hits that you're doing in her actual kit, meaning that never mind the bloom damages doing such a huge number, now NILOU herself can back herself off to, let's say, 60k HP, take off a lot of those HP numbers, maybe try to, balance out a little bit of a better crit ratio, and now if you kind of start to crit, even you can just full blown go into crit damage and still, or maybe just keep your HP. This is still a 35 at the end of the day. If she's getting, up to 50,000 HP, she's still at a 35 over 110 because the initial stats are 5% crit rate and 50% crit rate, which means she'll be at a 35 over 110. Once again, that is effectively 2.1 times damage on her initial hits whenever she's doing those hydro hits in her skill and her burst. So still, it's only going to be happening probably with a 35% crit rate 1 in 3 times, but still, with the amount of time she can hit, that still could be some pretty good damage, especially with these other buffs that we get to see with the rest of her constellations. So if you do have the C6 and you're going for it, it changes NILOU a little bit, but it can also keep her very much the same. Now, once again, I do want to talk about, like I normally do with looking at constellations for people, if you're sitting at C0 and you're looking at some constellation for some characters, NILOU does have some pretty good first constellations. I would say her C2 looks a little bit more tempting than her C1, although her C1 is still very good, and it does allow you to actually start leveling into her skill and her burst. Specifically though, the C2 is where you're going to be helping your bloom core damage as well as your skill and your burst damage hits, whereas the first constellation here kind of only helps the kind of skill damage initially, as well as some extra longer duration of actually the tranquility aura, which means constant and more hydro application over a longer period of time, possibly meaning that you can get more blooms out in a, once again, longer period of time. So, but I do think at the end of the day, though, that the C2 is still better. So if you're aiming for a NILOU constellation, go for C2 if we're trying to look at the beginning of the character. Now looking at a party setup for actually looking at the different teams that you can make with NILOU, obviously with her passive talents, she's pretty stuck with a bloom team. Even with looking at other things that you can do, you lose those bountiful core damage hits, those huge damages that you can get, or once again, the more consistent damage you can get. And also you lose the passive talent as well, because it's only happening for bountiful core damage. You lose so much personal damage on those bloom core hits if you throw in any other element besides hydro and dendro. So my personal opinion, you're really only going to sit on bloom, and that's really the only way to really build her. But once again, I think some of the best teammates that she can have are Furina and Baizhu. Another character you could even throw in here technically would be someone like Yao Yao if you have them built, or if you want to just use her in general, that's just another great character. You could even throw in someone like Kale, Dendro main character, or the Dendro Traveler, who's also known as, and then also even other characters that could help. I mean, Kave is even another character you can use as well. Kirara is another Dendro character. There's a lot of different characters that you can use. But in my personal opinion, the best team that you're going to see out there is going to be Furina, Baizhu, NILOU, and Nahida. The reason why Nahida is going to be so good is because she's giving a 250 maximum EM buff to the character that's in the Shrine of Maya, and that's going to be extremely good because that's from a passive talent that she has. But basically at that point in time, she can give 250 EM to NILOU, which once again, we know that the bloom damages is going to be helping. Obviously, more EM means higher damage for the bloom damage numbers, so that's going to be very good because she's already giving a huge buff to the bountiful cores that she's creating and the bloom that she's doing. So already that's a great buff. Baizhu is just a solid healer, especially the small amounts of ticks for healing is going to be very good against the constant bloom hits that even someone with 70 something thousand HP that NILOU has. It's still going to be very helpful to keep alive with someone like Baizhu, and even someone like Yao Yao as well if you build her correctly and just go full blown into healing, as well with a little bit of energy recharge. Someone like Furina is going to be great because other characters give an attack buff, or they give, some extra elemental damage buff or something like that. And, that's helpful to an extent. Kazuha helps with, swirling something. But Kazuha is useless here because the bloom damage numbers are green and they're Dendro, which means that he can't swirl Dendro with Anemo, which means he can't give an elemental damage bonus buff to the character or to NILOU, but he can help her hydro numbers, but that's not really what you're looking for. So the reason why Furina is good, against the other characters is that she's going to be buffing just a straight damage. So any type of damage that the characters do, she's buffing it. So all characters in the party are getting a damage buff based off the changes in HP in the team. And once again, because the bloom numbers are consistently hitting, yes, they're hitting the enemy, but they're also hitting you a lot, which is why you usually want to have a very high HP character on field, which is why, once again, it makes sense to run NILOU on field, because her HP should be very, very high compared to the other characters on the team, even with someone like Baizhu and Furina on the team. So keeping that in mind, Furina is helping a huge damage buff, being a great support. Nahida's helping NILOU get a huge EM buff. And then Baizhu actually has something in actually one of his special talents. Never mind just amazing healing for stacks for, just keeping the team alive, because he's healing everyone. And it's also counteracting Furina's HP drain. And it's also helping give her more stacks for her buff. So that's going to be extremely good. Never mind that though, but in one of his passive talents he has, it actually states that based on his HP, he will actually get to a point where he will be increasing Burning Bloom, Hyper Bloom, Burgeon reaction damage. And once again, the damage that NILOU does, even though it is not Dendro cores, it is Bountiful cores, it is still considered Bloom damage. So he can still be giving a very nice buff to Bloom as well. So once again, just another character that can be very, very good for that. Honestly though, like I said, if you're that's probably, in my personal opinion, the best team you're going to see, but there's so many characters you can use. Like I said, someone like Kave is going to be another good character, especially as a driver, he could be good. Even someone like Kirara could also be very helpful, helping out with shields so those things aren't blowing up and consistently hitting you too often, can help a little bit more with shields. Even someone with constant Dendro application like her, running around and hitting things multiple times. Someone like Kale, who's doing some kind of personal damage, but mainly there for application. I also talked about Dendro main characters, the same thing with that character as well. You're going into a full-blown idea of giving more application for triggering Bloom for NILOU and the other Hydro characters. Someone like Yao Yao is another great one because she's basically just 4-star Baizhu. Never mind constant Dendro application, but also constant and small bits of healing to counteract Furina's healing in that team. If you're trying to look for other, Hydro characters to slap in the team, someone like Barbara is very good, a very good healer. Characters like Kokomi are also very good. If you don't really have, another character that can help out, once again, Furina's a solid character to help out with that. So there's so many of the different Hydro and Dendro characters that can help out because they're usually very, very good with application that you can usually just slot them in a team. In my personal opinion, the best way to kind of go about this is to go 2 Dendro and 2 Hydro with the team, meaning that you're getting extra HP by 25% of your max HP from the base, meaning that you're helping characters like Baizhu, never mind his buff, but also his healing. Yao Yao's the same way. Also, you're helping Furina, getting more HP for her, which is helping personal damage. You're helping NILOU, which is also helping personal damage. And Nahida or any other character is probably not going to be using it to a great extent, but it's still going to be good for, I guess, just keeping them alive. Also, the double Dendro is going to be very useful for you. You're getting an extra 50 elemental mastery flat. And then if you create a bloom reaction, you're getting 30 more elemental mastery. So even through these 2 Dendro characters that you're putting on a team, by helping, never mind just create constant blooms for NILOU, you can get more elemental mastery, about 80 of it, just by creating a bloom reaction, which is once again basically another 2-piece elemental mastery from an artifact set. So very, very good, and it's very easy to kind of make NILOU teams, so hopefully that helps you when you're looking at teams to make. Well, hopefully that helped you guys know a little bit more on how to build NILOU, maybe some tips of what to do, especially with, looking at her talents as well as what artifacts to use. I know that kind of goes up in the air sometimes. And let me know down in the comments if you guys have a different way that you build NILOU, if you kind of go a similar route but kind of do something differently. Let me know the teams that you feel work best, if you kind of agree with me, if kind of the Furina, Baizhu, NILOU, Nahida is the best way, or if you think there's something maybe better. But besides that, thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.